That blizzard came down like a hammer from the heavens. Peering through that solid wall of swirling white snow, Matthew Hayes saw a dark shape just crumple to the ground. Now he had been out there riding his fence line, checking every single post before the storm buried his whole corner of the Montana Territory for good. It was February of 1885. In the wind, Lord, it howled like a pack of lonesome wolves, tearing at his old, worn-out cavalry coat and freezing the very breath right there in his lungs. The cold was dropping like a stone. The sky was a bruised-up purple-gray, pressing down hard on the valley like a heavy lid on a pot that was fixing to boil clean over. The barometer back in his cabin had dropped faster than he had seen in all his years. That was a bad sign. A fella caught in this kind of weather would be frozen solid before he could even count to 500. Matthew had almost missed it entirely. Just a dark little smudge against an endless sheet of white. It wavered for a moment, then the knees just buckled. And then it was gone. Right near his boundary marker, maybe 40 yards out, he figured. His one good eye narrowed against the stinging snow just to be certain of what he thought he had seen. Someone was definitely out there. He did not hesitate for a second. A man could not. Hesitating meant a cold, lonely death in these Montana winters. Come on now. Thunder. He gently urged his big horse to move forward. The animal argued with him for a moment, wanting to turn back toward the shelter of the barn, but it responded to the firm, familiar pressure of Matthew's knees against its sides. 15 years riding together meant they understood each other without a word. Without a single word. That wind just sliced right through him. His layers were no match, and ice started crusting his beard. Each breath he took felt like swallowing fire, and his right leg throbbed where that Confederate mini-ball had shattered the bone clean through back at Antietam. Old war wounds always sang a sorry tune in the biting cold, a harsh reminder of debts already paid in blood. Matthew finally reached the fallen shape in a matter of seconds. It was a woman lying face down. She had one arm stretched out, like she was trying to grab hold of something that was not even there. Her fine leather coat was soaked completely, and her dark hair was frozen solid to the back of her neck. That was too fine a coat for these parts of the country. Those were city clothes, fancy Eastern clothes. He swung down from his horse, ignoring the sharp scream of pain that shot up from his bad leg. He pulled her up. She felt like dead weight, but then he felt it, a faint, shallow breath. Still breathing, but not for much longer in this freeze. Reckon it is not your day to cross over, ma'am, he muttered, heaving her up and across his saddle. Not if he had anything to say about it. The blizzard just swallowed them whole after that. A man could not see his own hand in front of his face. Matthew rode on using pure gut instinct and a little faith, counting fence posts that he could not even see, trusting his horse, Thunder, to find the way home. His own fingers were feeling dead inside his thick leather gloves. That was a very bad sign. The cold would take your fingers first, then your arms and legs, then your very life. His mind suddenly drifted back to Gettysburg, that awful July in 1863, dragging poor Lieutenant Collins through all that cannon fire. Fire after a cannonball took both his legs. He remembered that same burning in his lungs. He felt that same certainty back then, that every step could be the one that did him in. But he'd managed to get Collins to the field hospital. And that man had lived, went on home to his wife in Ohio. Some instincts just stay with a man. Some debts are never truly paid. All of a sudden, the cabin just appeared out of the white haze, a dark little square in a world of white fury. Matthew had built that place himself, right after the bank foreclosed on his family's farm. It had a stone foundation and timber walls, sealed up tight with mud and horsehair. It was small, but it was solid. It would hold up against anything the big Montana sky decided to throw down at it. He kicked the door open, carried her right inside, and laid her down near the stone fireplace. Her lips were turning blue, and she was shaking something awful. Her body was fighting the freeze, and it was losing. He worked fast, building the fire up high, his own hands shaking from the cold and the sheer urgency of it all. The kindling caught, then the split pine lit up, with flames licking their way upward. He pulled off her wet coat and her boots, trying to be respectful but feeling desperate. That coat was worth more than everything he had to his name. It was fine European wool lined with real fox fur, with brass buttons showing some kind of family crest. Her dress underneath was every bit as fine. It was a deep blue silk with some mighty fancy stitching on it. That was a dress for a fine city parlor, not the Montana wilderness. Matthew carefully wrapped her up in his one good wool blanket. It was the same one his own mother had woven for him. She made it long before the war, back before the whole world changed. The woman did not wake, she just kept on shivering. He sat with his back against the wall, feeling completely worn out. He just sat there watching her chest rise and fall with each breath. Outside, you could hear the storm screaming like a wild animal. Inside, the fire finally caught, coming to life. A warm orange light was dancing across the rough timber walls. She was alive. For right now, that was all that mattered. This land does not forgive anyone who hesitates. You either made your move, or you died. Matthew had made his move. Now the only thing left for him to do was wait. She awoke to the warm glow of firelight and the smell of coffee. It smelled bitter, strong, and wonderfully real. Her eyes opened very slowly and she felt lost and confused. Her body ached all over as if she had been trampled. The little room slowly swam into focus. It was a single room of rough-cut timber with a table and 2 chairs. Some shelves on the wall held tin plates, but not much else. A fireplace was crackling with a warm fire and a man was there. He was sitting across from her, just watching her quietly. "Easy now," he said in a calm voice. His voice was low and gravelly, like stones tumbling in a stream. "Just be steady. You had a very close call out there." She tried to sit herself up, but a sharp pain shot through her ribs. The sudden pain made her gasp out loud. "Be careful," the man said as he stood up to pour her some coffee from a dented old pot and offered her a simple tin cup. "It is not much, but it is warm." She reached out and took it, her hands trembling. The heat felt like life was seeping back into her bones. She took a sip. It was just awful. The coffee was burnt black as tar, but oh my goodness, it was strong enough to peel paint. And yet, it was the best thing she had ever tasted in her life. "Where am I?" Her voice was just a raspy whisper. "You are at my place, about 3 miles outside of Timberline." "The storm is still blowing hard," he said, gesturing to the window. Outside, a pure white fury continued to rage on. "I found you out near my fence line. You have been out for nearly a full day." "A whole day?" Her mind began to spin. He just nodded, not pushing her for anything more. "My name is Matthew Hayes," he said at last, setting down a plate with some beans and a little salt pork on the table. It was simple food. He took half for himself and left the other half for her. "Do you have a name?" She hesitated, knowing that if she told him who she truly was, everything would change in an instant. It always did. "Elizabeth," she finally said. Just that one name and nothing more. He simply nodded, accepting what little she offered without demanding more. It was then she really noticed the empty shelves in the kitchen, the patched-up roof, and the worn-out Bible with no cover sitting by his narrow bed. This man was sharing the very little he had in this world. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet and full of emotion. "You would have done the same." Matthew looked away, clearly uncomfortable with being thanked. Elizabeth wasn't so sure about that. She'd never been put to a test quite like that. They ate their meal in a comfortable quiet, not awkward at all, like 2 folks who'd just been through something serious together. The storm just kept on howling through the night. Matthew tended to the fire and showed her how to keep it burning steady without wasting good wood. That's when she noticed his shirt, torn right at the shoulder with a clumsy patch. "Here, let me," she said, reaching into the saddlebag that he'd managed to save for her. She found a small needle and some thread, little things she always carried with her, tools from a whole other life he knew nothing about. She started mending the tear while he watched over the fire. Neither one of them said a word. They just didn't need to. When she was all done, she handed it back over to him. Their fingers brushed against each other, just for a second. "You didn't have to go and do that. You already saved my life," Elizabeth replied. He looked at her then, really looked at her with eyes that had seen more than their fair share. One was a clear blue, the other a little cloudy from an old injury. "Truth be told, I don't know if I would have stopped for some stranger out in a storm like that," she admitted softly. Something passed between them in that moment, a silent understanding that neither one could put a name to. Elizabeth's hand went up to the little locket at her throat. It was solid gold, engraved with the Prescott family crest, and worth a whole lot more than this entire cabin. She quickly tucked it out of sight, real quick when Matthew happened to look her way. She just was not ready. Not yet. Then the morning came. A pale light started peeking through that one little window. Elizabeth woke up and saw that Matthew was already up, getting the fire going and making some more of that awful but wonderful coffee. On a rough-cut shelf right there by his bed, she spotted something she sure did not expect. Books, a whole little collection of them, all worn out and well-loved. Thoreau, Walden, Emerson, and even Shakespeare. Now that is not what you would expect from a rough-and-tumble rancher. "You read all this deep stuff?" she finally asked. A little hint of shyness crossed his weathered face. "Well, a man has got to feed his mind, same as he feeds his belly." She reached over and picked up that Walden book, which was open to a marked page. "The Mass of Men Lead Lives of Quiet Desperation." "You reckon he is right about that?" she asked him. Matthew thought on it for a second, pouring the coffee. "Some men maybe, but not all of them. Some folks find their purpose, even when times are tough." She started to wonder just what kind of tough times he had seen. The clues were scattered all around his little cabin. The patched-up clothes, that one single tin plate, and the old cavalry coat hanging by the door. It was blue, not gray, and then there was the little hitch in his step when he walked, favoring his right leg. "You fought for the Union?" she asked. His whole face went quiet. "Yes, ma'am, I did. The 7th Pennsylvania Cavalry. That war has been over for a while now, for over 20 years. Some troubles don't just end when the guns go quiet," he said, his voice low as he handed her the coffee. "Are you from around these parts, Elizabeth?" The way he spoke her name made it sound like something special, something real. "Timberline," she replied, which wasn't exactly a lie. "Well, that explains the coat." He nodded toward her expensive coat, which was now drying by the fire. "Not many folks around here can afford that fancy European wool and real silver buttons." She was taken aback that he would notice little details like that. "My father is quite comfortable," she admitted. "He's probably worried sick," she thought, but she didn't say anything more. Outside, the storm finally gave up, leaving the world looking all clean and quiet, like a fresh start written in the snow. Dawn broke, cold and bright. "The storm's passed," Matthew said. "You'll want to get on back before another one rolls in." Elizabeth nodded, even though a part of her didn't feel like leaving at all. This cabin, so rough and simple, felt more honest and safe than her father's big mansion ever had. They ate together one last time. It was more beans and weak coffee. "Can I ask you something?" Elizabeth said. Matthew looked up at her. "How did you come to be out here all alone like this?" He was silent for a good long while. Then he began to speak. He spoke real slow and deliberate, like a fella not used to telling his own story. "I lost my family's land to debt about 5 years ago. You see, after the war, the taxes just shot right up. The bank interest, too. My father passed from the consumption back in '79. My mother followed him just 6 months later. And my brother, he never made it home from Antietam." His hand drifted down and rested on his right leg without him even thinking. "I took a mini-A ball that very same day. It tore straight through the bone. The doctors, they were all for taking the leg right off. But I told them no." He stared down at his hands. They were calloused and scarred from hard work. "The bank took every last thing. 20 acres my own granddaddy cleared with his bare hands. The very house my father built from the ground up. Now I just work at another man's cattle. I live in a little shack on the edge of his property." His jaw clenched up tight. "The folks in town, they call me worthless. The landowners, they won't even give me the time of day." He finally looked up, and his eyes met hers. "But I have still got my word, and a man's word is all the real wealth he will ever need in this life." Elizabeth felt something just shatter deep down inside of her. This man, this good and decent man, he had absolutely nothing, yet he still went and saved her. He even shared his last bit of food with her. She almost told him right then and there, she almost said, "My name is Elizabeth Prescott, and my father, he owns the very bank that likely took your family's land. I could change everything for you." But a cold fear just stopped her in her tracks. What if telling him changed him? But what if all this kindness, this simple, beautiful thing was only real because he had no idea who she truly was? If there is some way I can repay you, she began to say. But Matthew just shook his head, a small smile on his face. You do not owe me a single thing, Elizabeth. This is just what good neighbors do for one another. She stood up then and gathered her few belongings. He had already saddled a horse for her, one of the only two he owned. He was lending it freely, not even asking when she would bring it back. At the doorway, she paused and turned back to him. Thank you, Matthew. You are letting me be the kind of man I always want to be, Elizabeth, he said, his voice low and sincere. And that is more than payment enough for me. Elizabeth climbed onto the horse, the cold air biting right through her coat. She turned in the saddle one last time and looked back. There was Matthew, standing on his porch, just watching her go. For a long moment, their eyes met and held. Something unspoken passed between them in that look, something that felt as fragile as it was real. And then she rode away. Her gloved hand went to the locket at her throat. The secret inside felt heavier than ever before, like a stone she was forced to carry and could never put down. Rich folks or poor folks, a blizzard treats everyone the same. But once the snow melts, the world always remembers who you are. And Elizabeth was no longer sure if she wanted to be that person anymore. Meanwhile, Samuel Prescott stood at the grand window of his study. He watched the snow blanket his enormous 20-acre estate, which held the finest house in all of Timberline, and maybe even the whole state of Montana. Territory, a grand 3-story Victorian home, a real showpiece with curved glass all the way from Philadelphia. All the furnishings came from New York, and he hired his staff from San Francisco. It was a monument built on the fortune he made during the war, selling the Union Army everything from their boots to their bullets. Any word? He asked, without even turning around. James Sullivan, his business partner, was standing right behind him, holding his hat in his hands. At 45, Sullivan was a full 15 years younger than Prescott, and just as ambitious, with that hungry look of a man who'd had a taste of real money and was fixing to get more. Nothing yet, sir. The men are out there searching every last farm and homestead within 20 miles. But this storm, I don't give a damn about the storm. Samuel turned, his face as hard as the granite stone in his fireplace. My daughter has been gone for nearly 2 whole days. You find her. Yes, sir. Sullivan paused for a moment. The engagement announcement can just wait until she is found, Samuel snapped back. The local newspaper was all set to announce the engagement of Elizabeth Prescott to James Sullivan, a move that would merge the two biggest financial powers in the whole territory. An arrangement that was set to make both of them a whole lot richer. If only his headstrong daughter would just cooperate. Cooperate. Samuel looked back at the snow. Sarah would have known how to handle Elizabeth. Sarah, his wife, dead these 15 years from consumption, taking with her all the softness in his world, leaving him with a daughter too much like her mother. Idealistic, stubborn. Tell Harkins if he doesn't find her by tomorrow, he's fired. Tell them all, no one sleeps until my daughter is home. Sullivan nodded, backing from the room. Samuel stared at the portrait above the mantel. Sarah in her wedding dress. Elizabeth as a child beside her. Before the coughing started, before the blood on handkerchiefs, before he buried his heart in a pine box and turned to the only comfort left, building an empire nothing could tear down. Where are you, girl? He whispered to the snow. News traveled faster than wildfire in a town with nothing better to burn. Elizabeth returned to her father's estate 3 hours later, riding Matthew's old mare. The ranch hands found her first, relieved, then anxious when they saw the unfamiliar horse. Within an hour, the whole territory knew the Prescott heiress had been rescued by Matthew Hayes. That broke rancher, the one with no land, no real prospects, no future to speak of. The whole town was split right down the middle. Some folks, well, they admired Matthew's grit. Takes a true man to ride into a storm like that, Judge William Davidson announced at the Mercantile, making sure he was loud enough for everyone to hear. Now, the old Union judge had lost an arm at Shiloh, but he'd earned the respect of folks on both sides for being square dealing in all the land disputes. He risked his own hide for a stranger, he said. That's the very thing we all fought for. But others, they just scoffed at him. Probably figured he'd get a reward, sneered James Sullivan as he leaned up against the post office wall. Maybe even marry up. That's what poor fellas do. Just waiting for a handout? Elizabeth heard all that talk, and it just plain turned her stomach. She tried to send him a proper thank you gift. We're talking quality tools, winter supplies, things Matthew truly needed. She sent it all with one of her father's ranch hands. She gave him strict orders to deliver it quietly. But Matthew, he refused it, and he did it in public. It all went down at the Mercantile on a Saturday afternoon. The whole town was there watching. The ranch hand pulled up with the wagon. Matthew was inside, buying grain he could hardly afford. Miss Prescott sends her thanks, the hand announced. He gestured over to the fine tools in the wagon. She says you've more than earned these. Matthew just looked at those tools. Good steel, worth months of wages, just sitting there on the counter. He slowly shook his head. I was not looking for any payment. Y'all can take them back. The whole store went quiet as a graveyard. Then James Sullivan decided to speak up. Now Sullivan was everything that Matthew was not. He was wealthy, well-educated, and born with a silver spoon. He had been courting Elizabeth for a full 2 years, just assuming that sooner or later her father would see things his way and arrange the marriage. Well now, that is mighty convenient, Sullivan said with a smile as cold as ice. You just happening to be there right when she needed a hero. Matthew turned around real slow, his jaw clenched tight, but his voice came out calm and even. There is not a single thing convenient about a blizzard. Sullivan stepped in closer, puffing out his chest. She belongs with her own people, farm boy. Not with some charity case. The air in the Mercantile got thick. Everyone held their breath. Matthew met Sullivan's gaze head on. I reckon she belongs with whoever treats her like a human being, not like a piece of property. He paid for his sack of grain and walked right out the door. The tools sat there on the counter, completely untouched. He had refused them. A pile of gold cannot keep you warm in a bad storm. Only a warm fire and a good heart could do a thing like that. But gold sure did make people act ugly afterward. Matthew rode his horse home all alone. The tools stayed behind in town, a clear sign of the divide that wealth can create between folks. On his own porch, Matthew sat down and watched the sun dip below the horizon. The mountains were on fire with shades of orange and purple, a beautiful and lonely sight. But he paid it no mind. His thoughts drifted back to Elizabeth. He wondered if she had heard what that man Sullivan said, and he wondered if it even mattered to her. Probably not. Folks with money and folks without, well, they just did not belong in the same world. It had always been that way, but for just a little while, during that big old storm, none of that seemed to matter a bit. And Matthew just could not stop thinking about the way she had mended his old shirt, the gentle care in her hands, and the peaceful quiet between them that felt an awful lot like home. He turned and went inside, closing the door. Out in the yard, the evening chill began to settle. Elizabeth was in her bedroom, just staring at her own reflection in the big fancy mirror. She could barely recognize the woman looking back. 2 days in that simple cabin had changed something deep down inside of her. Or maybe it just showed her what was there all along. Just then the door opened. Her father walked right in without so much as a knock, as was his way. You had the entire county out searching for you, Samuel said, his voice flat. There was no hug, no sign of relief, just blame in his words. What on earth were you thinking riding out in that kind of weather? I needed some space to think, Elizabeth answered quietly. The storm came up much faster than I expected. You could have died out there. I nearly did. A man named Matthew Hayes saved my life. Samuel's face grew hard at the mention of that name. Yes, he said, the drifter. I have heard about him. He is not a drifter. He works cattle over at Judge Wilson's place. He's got his own little cabin, but it's on borrowed land. That man lost his family's farm. Just poor management. Elizabeth whipped around, her eyes flashing with fire. Poor management. The banks jacked up their interest rates right after the war. Good men who went off to fight for their country came home to find their families just drowning in debt. That is exactly what happened to Matthew's folks. Samuel just waved a hand like he was shooing away a fly. Business is business. The weak get washed out. The strong survive. Is that something our mother would say? Elizabeth knew it was a low blow, bringing their mother Sarah into it. But she had seen the look in Matthew's eyes when he talked about losing his family's land, the very same piece of earth his own grandfather had cleared with his bare hands. Samuel's back went ramrod straight. You will not speak of your mother in this conversation. She taught me to have a heart, to see folks as people, not just numbers on a ledger. A soft heart does not build empires. Samuel moved to the window, gazing out at his vast estate. I have worked too hard and come too far to watch you throw it all away on some silly notion about a penniless cowboy. I am not throwing anything away. He saved my life, and I only wanted to thank him right and proper. You sent him tools that were worth a whole month's wages, and he deserved every last one of them. He turned them down flat and publicly made our family name look foolish. Elizabeth's brow furrowed. What? Your hero made a big old show of turning down the Prescott at charity this afternoon. The whole town saw it happen. Samuel turned to face her again. Sullivan was there, you know. He said that Hayes fella acted like he was too good to accept a helping hand. Pride. The last thing a man has when he's got nothing else. Elizabeth sat on the edge of her bed. Matthew had turned down her gift, not because he did not need it, but because of what? Because it was from her, because he found out who she really was. The announcement of your engagement is going in the paper come Monday, Samuel went on. You are going to marry Sullivan this spring. All the arrangements have been made. I never said I would marry him, Elizabeth said, her voice low. This is not about what you agreed to. This is about securing our family's standing. Sullivan, he has got friends in Washington. Together, you two will inherit the biggest financial empire in this whole territory. But I do not love him. Samuel let out a laugh, a short, ugly sound. Love? Your mother loved me. And you see what good that did her. In the ground at 42, he walked to the door. Get some rest. You have had a rough day. Sullivan is coming to call on you tomorrow, and you will welcome him properly. The door clicked shut behind him. Elizabeth just sat there, still as a stone, staring at the wall. Then her gaze drifted down to her riding boots, still caked with a mix of mud and snow. She made up her mind. Right then and there, she decided she had to see Matthew again. She just had to look him in the eye and understand why he had turned down her gift. And she needed to know if he felt any different now that he knew who her family was. The very next morning, she was up and dressed before the sun. Before her father could put a stop to it, and before she could talk herself out of it, Elizabeth saddled her horse, quiet as a church mouse, and slipped out through the property's back gate. The ranch hands, well, they just pretended they didn't see a thing. They liked her, and they all knew her heart was better than her old man's. The ride out to Matthew's little place took a good hour. The Texas sunrise caught her halfway there, painting the sky with pink and gold that spilled right over the mountains, making all that snow on the ground glitter like a million tiny stars. She finally found him out in the corral, working on mending a fence. He looked up the second he heard her horse approaching. A flash of surprise crossed his face, but it was quickly followed by something much warmer. He set his tools down in the snow and wiped his calloused hands on his jeans. Well, now, I surely wasn't expecting company, Matthew said with a hint of a smile. I came to thank you the right way, Elizabeth told him, swinging down from her horse. She took a breath, feeling the cold morning air in her lungs. I told you before, ma'am, no thanks are necessary. I know. She took a careful step closer to him. But I wanted to see you again. Those words just hung there between them, so honest and so real. Matthew just gave a slow nod toward his cabin. Well, the coffee's on. And so they walked to the little house together. Elizabeth watched him move. Not a single wasted motion, just steady and sure. He was a man who had learned how to make a little go a long way. Inside the cabin, she took a real good look around this time. She noticed the little details. The chair he had carved by hand, the small shelf holding just 3 books, and the window perfectly placed to catch the morning sun. Did you build all this yourself? She asked him. Most of it. It took a good 2 years. Elizabeth ran her hand across the wooden table. It is so smooth and solid. It is truly beautiful. Matthew poured them both a cup of coffee. They sat across from each other, just like they had done during that terrible storm. Why did you refuse to take the tools? She asked gently. I know you could have used them. I did not want folks thinking I helped you just to get something for it. His eyes met hers, clear and direct. Some things a person should do simply because it is the right thing to do, not because there is some reward. But not everyone thinks that way. Then again, not everyone spent 4 long years watching men die for something they believed in, he said in a quiet voice. It changes how you see the world. Elizabeth nodded slowly. My father thinks I am being completely foolish. He says I have made up a fantasy about you just because you saved my life. Matthew's face gave nothing away. And have you? He asked. No. She looked down into her coffee cup. I believe I see you very clearly. That is exactly why I am here. What do you dream about? She asked him suddenly. Matthew blinked, a little surprised. What's that? When you're out, here mend and fence, riding the line all by your lonesome? What do you dream about? He got real quiet for a good long while. Used to be I'd dream about land, about having my own place again, something to pass down to my kids someday. He stared down into his coffee cup. Now, I reckon I just want to be the kind of man. Me worth remembering, that would be enough for me. Elizabeth felt something break wide open inside her chest. Here was a man who had nothing to his name, and his only dream was to be a good man. You don't know who I really am, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Matthew just looked at her. I know enough. I know you took the time to mend my shirt. And I know you weren't one bit afraid to work right alongside me during that storm. That's plenty enough for me. She wanted to tell him. Right then and there, she wanted to confess it all. The money, what everyone expected of her, the gilded cage that her life had turned into. But then Matthew stood up. He nodded his head toward the corral. Come on, I'll show you something. So they walked back outside. The sun was a little higher in the sky now, warming up the air. Matthew led her over to the long stretch of fence line and showed her the cattle grazing peaceful in the pasture below. They're not mine, he said, but I take care of them. Just like they were. That's what matters. They stood there a moment, side by side, their shoulders nearly touching. Elizabeth looked over at him. I mean, she really looked. She saw the fine lines around his eyes, etched there from years of squinting into the bright sun and the driving snow, the small scar on the set of his jaw, the quiet strength in the way he stood his ground. Matthew, he turned to face her. Their faces were close, a little too close. For a single heartbeat, the whole world seemed to go still. Then Matthew took a step back. I ought to get back to my work. Elizabeth just nodded, her throat feeling tight. I should be going. They walked to her horse in a heavy silence. She swung into the saddle, looking down at him. Thank you for everything. Any time, Miss Prescott. She turned to her horse and rode away, not daring to look back. But up on the ridge, her father's men were watching. 2 riders, just dark shapes against the wide-open skywasi. Elizabeth saw them, all right. Her stomach dropped right to her boots. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Now a woman who wasn't afraid of a little hard work was rarer than a cool breeze in August. But a woman who defied her own powerful father, well, that was just plain dangerous. And Elizabeth had just stepped clear over a line she could never go back across. The 2 men watched her ride back toward town. Then they looked at each other. Sullivan had paid them mighty well to follow her, to report back on her every move. One of them pulled out a small notebook and jotted something down, noting the time and the place. This was evidence, the kind of ammunition that could destroy a person's good name. In the distance, Matthew went back to fixing his fence, completely unaware that the simple act of sharing a cup of coffee with Elizabeth Prescott had just set things in motion. In motion, that was fixing to swallow them both whole. Now some storms, they just roll in from the sky, but others, they stir up right in the hearts of men. And either one could put you in the ground just the same. Timberline was not much of a town, mind you, barely 500 souls calling it home. But like any place where folks decide to settle, there were lines you could not see that cut the town in two, just as sure as the wooden stakes marking off a man's land. The north side of town, that belonged to the merchants and the bankers. Their big, fancy houses were set way back from the wedding clean streets. The south side housed the laborers, the ranch hands, and all the folks whose luck had soured right around the time of the war. Right in between them stood the Mercantile, the church, and the Red Eagle Saloon. It was a kind of neutral ground where all those divisions got a little bit blurry after the sun went down. That Monday morning, the Mercantile was packed tighter than a tick. A fresh supply wagon had just pulled in from Helena, drawing people from all across the county. Judge William Davidson stood right there near the counter. His empty left sleeve was pinned up real neat-like to his side, a souvenir from a rebel cannonball back at Shiloh. At 65 years old, the judge still stood straight as a fence post with eyes clear as day. His silver hair and beard gave him the look of a prophet straight out of the good book. 4 pounds of coffee beans, he said to Carl Weber, the German fella who owned and ran the store, and any letters that might have come in. Stage, Weber nodded, scooping coffee beans into a brown paper sack. Did you hear about the Prescott girl, Judge? They found her nearly frozen solid out in that blizzard. I heard. Davidson's voice was steady as a rock. They say that Hayes fella is the one who pulled her out, rode straight into the worst of it to bring her back. The judge's eyebrow twitched just a little. You mean Matthew Hayes, the old soldier who's been working out at Wilson's place? That's the one. The man's got true grit. I will give him that much. Just then the little bell over the door chimed. The quiet chatter in the store just stopped when James Sullivan walked in. He took off his expensive beaver hat and dusted the fresh snow from his fine wool coat. 4 of Prescott's ranch hands trailed in right behind him. You could tell by the brand on their gear. Sullivan spotted the judge and gave a short little nod, but it was the kind of gesture that had no real respect in it. Judge, a fine morning, Sullivan said. Davidson took the greeting with a chill in his eyes. Those two men had locked horns more than once in land court, with Sullivan always fighting for the Prescott family's interests, which always seemed to grow bigger at the expense of the struggling folks trying to make a home here. Sullivan walked right up to the counter and handed Weber a piece of paper. This is Mr. Prescott's monthly supply order. Yes, sir, Mr. Sullivan. Weber took the list, and his whole attitude shifted, becoming a lot more cautious. Behind Sullivan, his men started to spread out through the store, their presence filling the small space. His presence just filled up the room, pushing everyone else toward the edges. Coffee's gone up again, Weber said. Some supply problems down in Brazil. Well, Mr. Prescott pays the price that was listed on last month's contract, Sullivan said back. The ups and downs of the market are your concern, not his. Weber's face turned red, but he just nodded. Everyone knew that Prescott's credit was what kept half the businesses in this town afloat. Davidson watched that whole exchange with narrowed eyes. That contract law cuts both ways, Sullivan. A merchant has a right to fair pay for his goods. Sullivan turned around, smiling but with no warmth in it. Legal advice is always welcome, Judge, but I do believe Mr. Weber and Prescott Enterprises, we understand each other just fine. The little bell over the door jingled again. Matthew Hayes walked in, stamping the snow from his boots. The room got even quieter. Hayes had on his usual worn-out cavalry coat, patched-up trousers, and about a week's worth of beard. His clouded right eye caught the lantern light as he scanned the room, his gaze resting on Sullivan for a moment before he walked to the counter. Morning, Carl, he said in a low voice. Needed some grain for my horses, about 20 pounds. Weber nodded, looking mighty nervous now, with both men standing at his counter. Right. A short distance away, Mr. Hayes Sullivan watched Matthew. He had the cold, detached interest of a man studying some kind of peculiar insect. Well, now the whole town is talking about your heroics. Mighty convenient, you stumbling across the Prescott heiress. Matthew turned around real slow. I was not looking for anyone. I just saw somebody who needed a helping hand. Of course, that slick smile on Sullivan's face never moved an inch. How very noble. Elizabeth was quite taken with your, shall we say, rustic hospitality. The ranch hands with him chuckled. Matthew's expression did not change one bit, but his good eye hardened like flint. Miss Prescott was a respectful guest. She did not complain once about where she was staying. Yes, well, she has always been charitable toward the less fortunate. Sullivan's voice carried clear across the store. She sent you a little token of her appreciation. I do believe she did, which you turned down in front of everyone. Matthew met Sullivan's gaze head on. I did not do it for a reward. No, Sullivan said, stepping closer. Then what did you do it for? Surely it was not just from the goodness of your own heart? Judge Davidson moved right between them, his presence alone creating some space. I would say saving a life does not need any justification, Sullivan. Most men who have served their country understand that. Sullivan's jaw tightened at the unspoken insult. He had spent the war managing his family's affairs, looking after his daddy's business, never once putting on a uniform. Now, as enlightening as this little chat has been, gentlemen, I've got my own business to see to. Sullivan picked up his hat. Hayes, I am sure Miss Elizabeth appreciates you keeping things quiet about the time she spent under your roof. A good lady's reputation is a mighty fragile thing. That threat just hung there in the air, as clear as a coiled rattlesnake. But Matthew's voice stayed steady. A true gentleman protects a lady's honor. He does not call it into question. The whole store seemed to hold its breath at once. Sullivan's face turned beet red, but he got a hold of himself right quick. Indeed. Good day to you, gentlemen. As Sullivan and his men walked out, Judge Davidson turned right to Matthew. That man there has the moral compass of a rabid coyote. Matthew just nodded. Paying old man Weber for the grain. It does not matter. I have got nothing he wants. Do not be so certain. Davidson watched through the big storefront window as Sullivan got on his horse. You have got his full attention now. That is rarely a blessing. Matthew hoisted the heavy sack of grain. Judge, with all due respect, I have stared down Confederate artillery. Mr. Sullivan does not worry me one bit. Davidson's weathered face creased into a slight smile. Artillery lets you know it is coming, son. Men like him do not. Like how Sullivan tends to strike from a man's blind side. He settled his hat on his head with his other hand. Where did you serve? The judge asked. 7th Pennsylvania Cavalry. We were known as Mindy's Sabres. Davidson gave a respectful nod. That was some hard fighting down at Chickamauga. Yes, sir. Lost a whole lot of good men there. The judge sized him up. You know, Hayes, I could surely use a man with your kind of experience. My clerk lit out for California about a month back. The position is open if you have a mind for it. It pays a sight better than being a cowhand. Matthew looked genuinely surprised. I appreciate that offer, Judge, but I am not much of a man for shuffling papers. You think on it. This town could use more men who ride toward the storm instead of riding away from it. With that, Davidson picked up his coffee cup. Good day, Hayes. Back outside, Matthew tied the sack of grain to his saddle, his mind wrestling with the judge's words. That offer came right out of the blue. A job as clerk to the county judge would mean steady pay, some respect, and a future that was more than just getting by. But it would also mean living in town, dealing with politics, and picking a side in the quiet war that was tearing Timberline apart. He swung up onto his horse, not knowing that right across the street, Sarah Davidson was watching him from her father's office window. The judge's daughter had seen the whole thing unfold in the store. At 25 years old, Sarah, she had her daddy's steady gaze and her late mother's fiery auburn hair. She was unmarried by choice, not for a lack of gentleman callers, and she helped run her father's business, handling both the paperwork and the personal matters. Sarah spotted Matthew right off, just a lone figure getting smaller and smaller against the snow-dusted mountains. Then she turned her mind back to the documents spread all over her desk. Land deeds, banknotes, tax liens, all little pieces of a puzzle her father had been putting together for months. It was a pattern of foreclosures creeping across the county like a dark stain, and all trails led right back to Prescott Enterprises and James Sullivan. Elizabeth Prescott sat in her father's study, her back straight as a board, hands folded neatly in her lap, just as she was taught to do as a little girl. Across the desk, Samuel Prescott looked over some documents, taking his sweet time and making her wait. That massive oak desk, brought in from Boston at a mighty high price, served as a wall between them, both in the room and in their hearts. The announcement will be in tomorrow's paper, Samuel finally said, not even looking up. Sullivan has already ordered fancy champagne from San Francisco for the engagement dinner next week. I have not agreed to marry him. Elizabeth spoke softly. Father, this is not about my agreement. Samuel carefully set his pen down on the desk. This is about your duty to our family's name. Is it my duty to marry a man who treats other folks the way Sullivan does? Elizabeth leaned in closer. You should have been there to hear him at the mercantile, just shaming Matthew Hayes in front of everyone, right after that man had saved my very life. Samuel's expression turned to stone. Hayes is just a failed farmer who couldn't hold on to what his own daddy left him. Sullivan is building an empire with our family's money and good name. The man has vision and ambition, Samuel said, as he stood and walked over to the window. Your mother would have understood why this union is so necessary. No, my mother would have seen Mr. Sullivan for the man he truly is. And what is that? Elizabeth met her father's cold stare. He is a man who measures the worth of everything and everyone by the dollars in their pocket. A businessman, is that what you mean? Samuel's voice went cold as ice. Just like your father. You were not always this way. Elizabeth's voice softened just a bit. Before Mama passed, you cared about people, not just about profits. Samuel turned away from her sharply. Sentimentality is a luxury for people who do not carry the weight of real responsibility. A sudden knock at the door cut through the tension. The housekeeper entered the room looking mighty nervous. Mr. Sullivan has arrived, sir. Show him in. In. Samuel tugged his vest down sharp. Elizabeth, you will be pleasant. This here discussion is over. Just then, James Sullivan walked in with that sure-footed gait of a man who's used to owning everything he sees. He carried a little velvet box and a bouquet of flowers grown in a hothouse, which must have cost a pretty penny to get your hands on in the middle of a Montana February. Samuel. The two men shook hands, firm as you please. Elizabeth, you are a sight for sore eyes today. Elizabeth just gave a small nod. Not a single word passed her lips. Sullivan, well, he either did not notice her chilliness or he flat out chose to ignore it, setting the flowers on the desk. I have brought you something else as well. He then flipped open that little velvet box, revealing a diamond ring that grabbed the winter sun and threw it back like cold fire. A little token, he said, for the future we are building together. It is beautiful, she said, the words feeling like they belonged to someone else. It belonged to my grandmother. Sullivan puffed out his chest. The women in my family have worn it for 3 whole generations. He carefully lifted it from its velvet bed. May I? But before Elizabeth could even think to answer, he had taken her hand, sliding that ring right onto her finger. It felt so heavy, so tight, like a beautiful cage closing right around her. A perfect fit. Sullivan beamed, as if the whole world agreed that this was exactly how it was meant to be. Samuel watched on with a look of pure satisfaction. James also brought some news about that big Washington contract, her father announced. Seems the territorial governor himself has put in a good word for us. Put in a bid for the Army supply contract. That's 5 whole years of guaranteed business, Sullivan chimed in. We're talking military outposts all across Montana, Idaho, and clear out to Wyoming. Prescott Sullivan Enterprises is going to be the biggest commercial outfit in this whole territory. Well, congratulations, Elizabeth said, her eyes fixed on the ring that was now tying her to this future. I was thinking we could announce it at our engagement dinner, Sullivan went on. The governor himself has agreed to be there, and several territorial legislators too. Samuel nodded. That's just excellent. Elizabeth, why don't you go on and show James all the preparations we've made for the dinner? It was a clear dismissal. Elizabeth stood up and led Sullivan out into the hallway. The second they were alone in that formal dining room, Sullivan grabbed her by the arm, spinning her around to face him. You seem a mite distracted today. It's just been a hard week. His fingers tightened just a bit. I heard you went to see Hayes again. And this was after your own father expressly forbade it. Elizabeth went rigid. You've had someone following me? I've been protecting your reputation. Sullivan's voice dropped low. Do you have any earthly idea how that looks? The Prescott heiress paying a visit to some bachelor's cabin all by herself. He saved my life and has been thanked more than enough. And yet, you keep on, seeking his company. Sullivan's eyes narrowed to slits. Folks are gonna talk. Then let them talk, she said. His grip on her arm got even tighter. Your father has worked his whole life to build this family's good name. I am not about to let you throw that all away because of some silly romantic idea about a cowboy with nothing to his name. Elizabeth pulled her arm free. You sound just like my father. Well, I will take that as a compliment. Sullivan took a moment to straighten his jacket. Your father understands how this world really works. Don't. Not the way some dreamers wish it would be. This Hayes fellow is a nobody, a relic from a war that's been over for a long, long time, a man who couldn't even hold on to his own family's farm. You know, nothing about him. Oh, I know everything about him, Sullivan countered, his voice low. I make it my business to know the full story of everyone worth knowing in this county. Matthew Hayes, 7th Pennsylvania Cavalry, took a bullet down at Antietam. His family farm was taken by the Montana Territorial Bank back in 1880. It seems he could not make good on his loans. Right now, he is just a hired hand for Judge Wilson, making a measly $30 a month. Elizabeth just stared at him, shaken by how cold he sounded. And I also know, Sullivan went on, leaning closer, that this little crush you have on him is going to end. Your future has already been decided. Me. And the sooner you wrap your mind around that fact, the better off we are all going to be. The threat tucked behind his words was as clear as a blue sky. Are you threatening me, James? I'm just making the expectations clear. His smile came back as cold and practiced as a card shark's. Now, how about we discuss the dinner menu? I have already taken the liberty of ordering some French wine. An 1871 Bordeaux, a mighty fine year. Elizabeth felt a cold shiver that had nothing at all to do with the Montana winter. In Sullivan's eyes, she saw no love, not even a flicker of desire, just cold calculation. The very same kind of look he might give a promising piece of land he was about to buy up. All afternoon, Matthew was out fixing the fence on the far western edge of Judge Wilson's property. It was steady, hard work that let his mind just drift. He thought about the offer from Judge Davidson. Working as a clerk would mean good, regular hours and sleeping in the same bed every single night, maybe even saving up enough money to buy his own small piece of land someday. Then his thoughts turned to Elizabeth Prescott and the way she looked riding off from his cabin just that morning, sitting tall in the saddle and so determined. That quiet understanding that had blossomed between the two of them during the storm, and how different she seemed from her father and that whole other world he lived in. The sound of hoofbeats on the dry earth pulled him out of his thoughts. It was two men on horseback, Prescott's men, you could tell by their gear. Matthew recognized them right away from town, Boyd and Miller. Both of them had ridden with the Confederate cavalry back during the war, and neither one of them had ever shown him a lick of respect. Well, look here, the Hayes boy, one of them called out as they rode up. Taking a little break from all that hero work? Matthew just set down his tools nice and slow. Something I can help you fellas with? Oh, we're just passing through, Miller said with a grin, but neither of them made a single move to ride on by. Just checking the fence lines, same as you. Prescott's land is a good 3 miles east of here, Matthew pointed out calmly. Boyd just smirked. Well, Mr. Sullivan himself asked us to take a look at the adjoining properties. Seems Mr. Prescott is thinking about buying up Old Man Wilson's spread. Matthew's face did not show a thing, but that news hit him like a punch to the gut. Judge Wilson was getting on in years and had been talking about heading back east to live with his daughter. Now, if Prescott bought up this land, Matthew would be out of a bomb and out of a home. Judge Wilson has not said a word about selling. A man his age with his health failing, Miller said with a shrug, this life is rugged. It just makes sense to cash out while he still can. Well, I suppose that is his business, Matthew said. He turned back to his work, driving a long staple deep into the fence post with a little more force than was necessary. It sure is, Boyd said, leaning on his saddle horn. Saddle horn? Well now, looks like you've been entertaining some high society company lately. That Miss Prescott seems mighty interested in your kind of hospitality. Matthew stood up straight, looking Boyd square in the eye. Spit it out, Boyd. Just a friendly word of caution, Boyd said, but his voice turned hard as iron. Miss Prescott is promised to Mr. Sullivan. A lady of her standing does not belong with a fella like you. Is that her thinking, or is that what Sullivan thinks? A smart fella would watch what he says, Miller chimed in, and watch his own back. A smarter man would say his piece and be on his way, Matthew shot back, his voice calm and steady, before this turns into something none of us is gonna like. The air got real still as the three men faced him. The old bad blood from the war, a war that was supposed to be over and done with, was boiling right there under their skin. Finally, Boyd gave a stiff nod. Message delivered. You enjoy this land while you still can, Hayes, because it is not going to be your home for much longer. With that, they turned their horses around and galloped away. Matthew just stood there and watched them go, his mind racing a mile a minute. The threat was plain as day. He was to stay clear of Elizabeth Prescott. And that story about Wilson's ranch? Well, it could be true, or it could just be a trap. No matter which, the ground felt like it was moving right out from under him. He finished patching up the fence and swung up onto his horse. But instead of going back to the house, his cabin, he pointed his horse west and headed for town. Judge Davidson's offer was certainly worth chewing on, especially now that his job at the mill was looking a mite shaky. The ride gave him a quiet moment to think about choices and where they lead a man. He thought about the long, hard road that had brought him here, and the war that cost him his brother and his own leg. He remembered the lean years that followed, trying to save the family farm while his folks' health just faded away, and then the foreclosure that took it all, leaving him with absolutely nothing to his name except for the horse he was riding. Soon enough, the town of Timberline came into view. As the afternoon shadows stretched out long, Matthew rode straight to the courthouse, a sturdy brick building standing proud at the north end of town. He hitched his horse and took the front steps, favoring his right leg just a bit after a long day of hard work. Inside, he found Sarah Davidson all by herself, tidying up some documents in the main office. She looked right up, clearly surprised to see him standing there. "Mr. Hayes, is there something I can help you with? I came to see your father, ma'am. He mentioned something about a clerk position." Sarah set down her stack of papers. "Well, he is in court until 4 o'clock. Are you telling me you are interested in the job?" "I am considering it." Matthew took off his hat, all of a sudden feeling the dust on his work clothes and the stubble on his face in that clean and proper office. Sarah studied him with intelligent eyes. "It's mostly record-keeping, land transactions, legal filings, court schedules. Father needs someone who can write a clear hand and understand basic legal language. My education's limited, but I can read and write well enough." She gestured to a chair. "May I ask why you're interested? Father mentioned you work for Judge Wilson." Matthew hesitated, then decided on honesty. Heard Wilson might be selling his place to Prescott. "Nothing certain, but seems wise to consider options." Sarah's expression changed suddenly. "When did you hear this?" "Today. Prescott's men mentioned it." She moved to a filing cabinet, withdrew a folder. "Did they say when this sale might occur?" "No, ma'am, just that Wilson's health was failing and he might want to cash out." Sarah opened the folder, scanning the documents inside. Snorts. "Judge Wilson visited this office 3 days ago. He showed no signs of failing health, nor mentioned any intention to sell." Matthew absorbed this. "Could be just talk then." "Perhaps," she replaced the folder, "or it could be part of a pattern we've been observing. We, my father and I." Sarah leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Hayes, what? Tell me, what do you know about the recent land deals happening in this county?" The question caught him off guard. "Not a whole lot. I know the railroad's been buying up parcels all along that proposed northern route. And just who is handling the railroad's business around here? Prescott Enterprises, I reckon." Sarah gave a slow nod. "Over the past 18 months, Prescott and Sullivan have gotten their hands on 17 properties in this county. Most of them belong to war veterans or their widows. And every single one was foreclosed on by the Montana Territorial Bank." Matthew's whole body went rigid. "That is the same bank that took my family's land. The very same one." Sarah's voice dropped low. "It is a bank where Samuel Prescott holds a controlling interest, even though his name is not on a single one of the public records." The meaning of her words settled like a stone in Matthew's gut. "What are you trying to tell me?" "I am not telling you anything just yet. My father and I are still gathering the proof." She watched his face carefully. "Your family's land was taken back in 1880, August the 15th. Do you still have the loan papers?" "The original agreement?" Matthew cleared his throat and shook his head. "The bank took every last thing, said we were 3 months behind on our payments. But my father, he kept careful track of everything. We had paid right on time. The office door swung open, and in walked Judge Davidson, taking off his black judicial robes. He stopped dead in his tracks when he saw Matthew. "Hayes, I sure didn't expect to see you again so soon." Matthew stood up. "I'm considering your offer, sir, if it is still on the table." "It is." Davidson hung his robes on a sturdy hook, "but I get the feeling there is a lot more to this visit," Sarah chimed in. "Mr. Hayes just told me that Prescott's men informed him Judge Wilson is selling off his ranch." Davidson's bushy eyebrows shot straight up. "Wilson said nothing of this to me, and we just played chess this past Wednesday evening. They claimed his health was failing him," Matthew added, "that he wanted to cash out and move on." The judge exchanged a heavy, knowing look with his daughter. "That is mighty interesting timing, sir." Matthew looked from one to the other. Davidson seemed to make up his mind. "All right, Hayes, what I am about to tell you requires complete discretion. My daughter and I have been doing some digging into a series of very questionable land deals involving Prescott Enterprises and the Montana Territorial Bank. Sarah mentioned it to me. What she could not mention is that we found hard evidence of altered loan documents. Interest rates were changed after the papers were signed. Payment records just disappeared from the bank. Properties were foreclosed on despite folks paying on time, even when the borrowers were making their payments on time." Matthew's jaw went tight. "That's just plain stealing." "It's fraud is what it is," Davidson corrected him. "But to prove something like that, you need the original papers, the ones signed by the folks who took out the loans. The very documents that the bank has been mighty careful to either destroy or change up. You figure they're aiming for Wilson's ranch now? It sure fits their playbook. It's a large piece of land right up against the existing Prescott properties. The owner is getting on in years, and it has some very valuable water rights." Davidson moved to a big map hanging on the wall, showing who owned what all across the county. "Now look here. Every single property you see in blue was bought up by Prescott in just the last 2 years. See the pattern?" Matthew leaned in, studying the map closely. "The properties marked in blue formed a kind of a rough pathway east from the mountains all the way down to the plains, following the natural flow of the watershed. They're grabbing all the water access." "That's exactly right. Here in Montana, whoever controls the water, well, they control just about everything." Davidson then pointed to Wilson's property, which was marked in green. "His ranch sits right at a crucial point in that whole watershed. If they get that land, Prescott would control the water rights for nearly half of the entire county. So why are you telling me this?" "Because you have already been a victim of their dirty tricks," Davidson said bluntly. "And also because I need a clerk that I can truly trust. I need someone who understands exactly what we are up against. Fighting." Matthew's gaze shifted from the judge over to Sarah, turning the whole thing over in his mind. Now going up against Prescott meant making some mighty powerful enemies. But walking away meant giving up any hope for justice, and not just for him, but for all the other folks who had lost every last thing. "The job pays $40 a month," Davidson went on. "It includes a room and your meals over in the building right next door, and you would be starting right away. Taking this job, well, that would put him square against Prescott and Sullivan," Matthew pointed out. "Yes, I reckon it would. They would surely see it as a betrayal." Matthew's mind went to Elizabeth, stuck right in the middle between her father and what she knew was right. This could make things mighty difficult for everybody involved. "Hard times have a way of finding us, whether we look for them or not," Davidson answered. "The only question is whether we face them on our feet or on our knees." Matthew stuck out his hand. "I'll take the job, Judge." The judge's handshake was strong, even with his one arm. "Welcome aboard, Hayes. Be here at 8 in the morning. Sarah will show you the ropes." As Matthew walked out of the courthouse, the full weight of what he had just done began to settle on his shoulders. He had just thrown in with the very man looking into Elizabeth's father for being a cheat. He had crossed a line, and there was no turning back. Was a line that just could not be uncrossed. Outside, the setting sun painted the whole tree line in shades of gold and long shadows. On the north side, the Prescott mansion stood tall, like a fortress on that hill, its windows already glowing with the first lights of the evening. So close in distance, yet a world away, separated by money, power, and now 2 different sides of the law. Matthew swung himself up on his horse for the long ride back to Wilson's ranch. Tomorrow he was fixing to start a new chapter. one that would either bring about real justice or cost him every last thing he had left. The Prescott mansion was all lit up, every single window glowing against the dark winter sky. Fancy carriages lined the circular drive, letting out all of Montana Territory's most important folks for the engagement party. You had government officials, bank presidents, and railroad men, all of them coming to watch the joining of two powerful families. Upstairs in her room, Elizabeth stood still as a stone while her maid fastened the last little buttons on her gown. It was an extravagant thing, made of blue silk and fancy French lace that had just arrived from New York only a few hours before. The diamond ring felt as heavy as a rock on her finger. "My, you look like a picture, miss," the maid said as she fixed a stray curl. But Elizabeth barely heard her. Just lost in her thoughts about the decision she was facing. Downstairs, 70 guests were waiting for the formal announcement of her engagement to James Sullivan. Her own father had already gone and told the territorial governor, who was all set to make a toast. The newspaper editor had even prepared a special edition. It sure seemed like there was no way out that wouldn't kick up a scandal that would surely destroy her father. A knock at the door broke through her worries. Samuel Prescott walked in, looking sharp in his evening wear, his silver hair and beard trimmed up fresh. "It is time," he said, offering her his arm. Elizabeth took it without really thinking. As they started toward the hallway, Samuel paused. "Your mother would be mighty proud tonight," he said, his voice softening for just a moment. "She always wanted to see you secure and respected." "Did she really?" Elizabeth met his gaze. "Or did she just want to see me happy?" Samuel's expression went cold again. "They are the same thing, if you understand it correctly." "No, they are not. You know good and well they are not." Elizabeth lowered her voice. "Father, I have heard some things about Mr. Sullivan, about how he and the bank seem to acquire properties." Samuel stiffened right up. "Those are just rumors, spread by people who failed because of their own foolish mistakes. I just don't see Judge Davidson as being incompetent. Davidson is just an old-timer, holding on to old grudges. That war ended 20 years ago, but fellows like him are still fighting it, just in a different kind of ring." Samuel's voice turned hard as iron. "Whatever you have heard, you forget it. Sullivan understands what the future of this territory is. Together, you two will build something that will last." "But at what price?" Elizabeth insisted. "I had a chat with Sarah Davidson yesterday. She showed me the paperwork on foreclosures from all across the county. There are patterns that look mighty deliberate." Samuel's face grew dark. "You went over to the Davidsons' place?" "After I told you specifically to stay clear away from that family. I needed to know the truth. The truth is, business calls for making hard decisions. Weak men will call it being ruthless. Strong men, they call it having vision." He squeezed her arm even tighter. "Now you pull yourself together. Our guests are waiting for us." The grand staircase swept down into a large foyer, packed with all of Montana's most powerful people. All eyes in the room turned upward as they appeared. Elizabeth felt every single stare like it was a physical touch. All their expectations pressing in from all sides. Sullivan was waiting at the bottom, looking sharp in his tailored suit, a winning look he could barely hide behind his well-practiced smile. Smile. "Right now, ladies and gentlemen," Samuel's voice boomed as they reached the foot of the stairs, "we thank y'all for joining us on this mighty important occasion. Tonight, we are here to celebrate more than just an engagement, but a partnership that is going to shape the very future of this Montana territory." A polite applause started to ripple through the folks gathered there. Sullivan, he then stepped forward, taking Elizabeth's hand right from her father's arm. His fingers felt like pure ice against her skin. "Elizabeth here has made me the happiest man alive," Sullivan announced for everyone to hear. "Together, we are fixing to build on the strong foundations that were laid by her very own distinguished father, creating opportunities that are sure to benefit every last person in this territory." The applause got a little louder. The territorial governor himself moved forward with his glass of champagne raised high. "A toast to the future Mr. and Mrs. Sullivan. May their union bring prosperity to all of Montana." You could hear glasses clinking all around. Elizabeth felt Sullivan's arms slide right around her waist, holding on tight as he accepted all the congratulations. Through the crowd of people, she caught glimpses of a few faces she recognized all too well. There was Judge Wilson, looking as uncomfortable as a cat in a room full of rockers in that formal suit. And the banker who had run the Hayes family right off their farm, he was now puffed up and flush with prosperity. And the newspaper, the editor who printed whatever Prescott's money told him to, and near the back, partly hidden by a column, was Sarah Davidson. For just a moment, their eyes met across the room. Sarah gave her the slightest little nod while slipping something out of her small purse and placing it on a side table right by the door before she quietly slipped out. The evening just dragged on in a blur of toasts and music and a whole lot of congratulations. Elizabeth played her part perfectly, smiling and thanking everyone, accepting all the good wishes she surely didn't feel. When the very last guest finally left, well past midnight, she dragged herself up the stairs to her room, feeling tired clear down to her bones. On her dressing table sat a folded note that definitely was not there before. Elizabeth opened it with trembling fingers. It read, "Court records show your father knew good and well the Hayes farm was current on its payments when he ordered the foreclosure. Matthew Hayes now works with us looking into these very cases. If you want to know the whole truth, come to the courthouse tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. Destroy this note. SD." Elizabeth stared at the words, their meaning burning right through her exhaustion. Her own father had deliberately taken the Hayes family's farm, knowing full well they were not behind on their payments. The very same father who now insisted that she to marry Sullivan, an architect known for similar shady deals all over the county. Without a second thought, she burned the note. She watched the paper curl and turn to black ash in the fireplace. And with it, her very last bit of faith in her father's way of doing business went up in smoke. That night felt like an eternity, but morning finally came. At the crack of dawn, Matthew was already at the courthouse, sorting through dusty documents in the records room. He'd spent a good part of the night moving the few things he owned into the little apartment right above the feed store. That was a kindness from Judge Davidson. Judge Wilson had accepted his resignation, sad to see him go, but he understood. "Your timing was something else," Wilson had told him. "I had a visit from Prescott just yesterday. He made a real nice offer to buy my place. Said I was looking a little peaked and that I should probably think about selling before the cold weather set in." Matthew kept sifting through the old property deeds, putting them in order by date, just the way Sarah had laid it out for him. The work was slow going, but it was sure telling a story. Right there in the paperwork, a clear pattern began to take shape. It was a map of Prescott's ever-growing empire. He was snatching up land from foreclosures and tax sales, and every single piece was expanding his hold right along the watershed. "Looks like you're making some real headway." Sarah's voice cut through the quiet. She stood in the doorway holding a tray with fresh coffee and warm biscuits. "Father always said you had a real knack for organization. The Army sure does teach a man to keep things tidy." Matthew took the cup of coffee, mighty grateful for it. "I believe I've found something mighty interesting. It seems every single property that was foreclosed on had its loan handled by the very same officer at the bank. James Sullivan." Sarah nodded. Before he ever went into business with Prescott, Sullivan was the chief loan officer over at the Montana Territorial Bank. He personally oversaw every single one of these transactions. That just cannot be a coincidence. It is not. She paused a moment. "I went ahead and invited someone to come join us this morning, someone who I reckon could help us with this investigation." Before Matthew could even get a word out, the outer door opened. Sarah stepped out, and her voice dropped to a low whisper as she spoke to someone. Then she walked back in with Elizabeth Prescott right beside her. Matthew stood up so fast his chair nearly tipped, the surprise clear on his face. Elizabeth had on a plain blue dress with her hair pulled back neatly, none of the fancy things he would have expected to see after a big engagement dinner just the night before. Their eyes met, and he could see a whole mess of feelings in hers, a mix of grit and doubt. "Mr. Hayes," her voice was proper and held in check, "I've been told that you are now working with Judge Davidson." "Yes, ma'am. I just started yesterday." Elizabeth then turned to look at Sarah. "You said there were some papers, some kind of evidence." Sarah pulled a folder from a stack on her desk. "These are copies of bank records my daddy got his hands on, thanks to a court order. They show you the original loan agreements made to several properties around here, including the Hayes family farm." Elizabeth reached out and took the folder. She opened it up real slow. And these papers prove it was all a dirty deal. They show things don't add up between what folks signed for and what the bank came back and claimed later. Interest rates were changed. Payment records were all messed with. Sarah pointed to some specific lines on the paper. In Mr. Hayes's case, the bank swore he missed 3 payments, but these records here show that all his payments came in right on time. Elizabeth's face went pale as a ghost as she looked over the documents. She whispered, "My father's name is signed on these authorization forms." "Yes, ma'am. As the bank president, he approved every single foreclosure." Matthew watched the color drain from Elizabeth's face as the hard truth finally settled in. Her father was not just involved in these awful things. He was the one directing them. "And there is more," Sarah went on. "We believe Sullivan and your father are fixing to go after Judge Wilson's ranch next. They have already paid him a visit about selling it." Elizabeth slowly closed the folder. "Why are you showing this to me?" "Because you need to know exactly what kind of man your future husband is." Sarah's voice was gentle but firm. The good life that was built by Prescott Enterprises was built on the backs of hard-working families like Mr. Hayes's. Elizabeth looked right at Matthew. "Did you know I was going to be here?" "No." He met her gaze without flinching. "I never would have used you against your own daddy, no matter what he has done. And yet, you took this job to investigate him. I took it to find the truth." Matthew stood a little taller. "Your father took every last thing from my family. If he did the same thing to other folks, then that truth deserves to see the light of day." Elizabeth looked between them, a firm decision forming right there in her eyes. "What you are doing could ruin my father, his good name, his entire business." "Yes," Sarah agreed softly. "It could. And my engagement to James Sullivan would become mighty difficult to keep." Elizabeth walked over to the window, staring out at the snow-dusted tree line. When she turned back around, the uncertainty in her face was gone. "What do y'all need me to do?" Sarah and Matthew shared a knowing look. "We need a look at your father's private records. Any letters between him and Sullivan about these properties, and some kind of proof they knew these foreclosures were just plain wrong." "Sarah, you are asking me to go against my own father. I am asking you to stand up for the truth." She answered, "No matter what comes of it." Elizabeth's hand went right up to her throat, without her even thinking about it, right where that gold locket was tucked away, the one with the Prescott family crest, hidden under her dress. The weight of her family's name, of what everyone expected, felt heavy on her heart. "I need some time to think on this." She handed the folder right back to Sarah. "This is not some simple choice to make." "Of course," Sarah said, putting a hand on Elizabeth's arm for just a moment. "Whatever you decide to do, this conversation stays right here between us." Elizabeth gave a slow nod, then turned her eyes to Matthew. "Mr. Hayes, could I have a private word with you?" Sarah understood and quietly slipped back into her father's office. Once the door was closed, Elizabeth stepped a little closer to Matthew, keeping her voice down low. "Why did you not ever tell me that it was my father's bank that took your family's farm? Would it have made a difference? Back in that cabin, with the storm going on, we were just 2 people. No last names, no past to worry about." "Well, it matters now." Her eyes were searching his for an answer. "Everything matters now." Matthew paused for a second, then he just laid it out plain. "Your father used crooked ways to take my family's land. That is the honest-to-God truth those papers prove. But that does not change a thing about what happened between us. That was real too." "What happened between us?" Elizabeth's voice cracked a little. "I am engaged to Sullivan now, so they went and made it official last night." "I heard. Congratulations, I suppose." His voice wasn't bitter, just tired and resigned to the facts. "But that's not what I want." She said it so quietly, like the words had to fight their way out. "Then what is it you want, Elizabeth?" She couldn't meet his eyes. "Something impossible. A path forward where I do not have to choose between my own father and what I know is right. Sometimes there just is not a clean path to take." Matthew's voice got a little softer then. "There is just the one that lets you look at yourself in the mirror. Come morning time." Elizabeth finally looked up and met his gaze. And in that moment, a whole conversation passed between them without a single word. Then she straightened her shoulders. She cleared her throat. her mind made up. I will help you, not to tear down my father, but to find out the truth, no matter what that means for any of us. Just then, the big courthouse door banged open. Before Matthew could even say a word, Judge Davidson came rushing in, and his face was all kinds of serious. Elizabeth, you have got to get out of here right now. Sullivan and your daddy, they are on their way over here. The color drained from her face. How could they possibly know? Somebody must have seen you come in. You know word travels fast here in Timberline. Elizabeth quickly started for the back exit, but Judge Davidson just shook his head. It is too late for that. They are already coming up the front steps. Hayes, you get her into my chambers. Now, Sarah, you do what you can to stall them. Matthew gently guided her toward the door. Elizabeth slipped through the record room and into Judge Davidson's private office. They had barely gotten the door shut when voices started echoing from the main hall. Where is she? Samuel Prescott's demand rang out loud and clear. Who, Mr. Prescott? That was Sarah's voice, calm and steady as a rock. My daughter, she was seen walking right into this building. Plenty of folks visit the courthouse, Sarah replied politely. Our public records are available for all citizens to see. Do not play games with me, Miss Davidson. That was Sullivan's voice, now gone cold with pure anger. Is Elizabeth in here or not? Through a tiny crack in the door, Matthew could see Samuel Prescott's face was flushed bright red with fury. Sullivan stood right beside him, his eyes scanning the room like a hawk on the hunt. Mr. Prescott, Mr. Sullivan, Judge Davidson's powerful voice cut right into the conversation. This here is a place of law. You will either conduct yourselves with respect or you will leave. My daughter has been poisoned by your meddling, Samuel accused him. First, that clerk position you offered to Hayes, and now you're having secret meetings with Elizabeth. You are trying to undermine my business. If doing things the right way can be undermined by the plain truth, well, maybe they deserve a little looking into, Davidson replied smoothly. Sullivan took a threatening step forward. You best tread carefully, Judge. That seat of yours is not immune to a little political persuasion. The governor, well, he thinks mighty highly of his friendship with Prescott Enterprises. Now, are you trying to threaten an elected official? Sullivan, Judge Davidson's voice turned to steel. That would be a very poor choice. Right there beside Matthew, Elizabeth just listened, with her hand pressed tight against her mouth. The very men she had looked up to her whole life, her own father and her fiancé, were showing their true colors, all ugly ambition and a readiness to make threats. Search this entire building, Samuel ordered, his voice booming. Elizabeth, if you are in here, you show yourself this instant. This childish little game of yours is over today. Judge Davidson took a step forward, planting himself in the path to his chambers. You have no authority to be searching these court offices, Prescott. Now, I strongly suggest you leave before this turns into a serious legal matter. The air in the room was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Matthew could feel Elizabeth shaking right next to him, completely torn between staying hidden or stepping out to face her father. All right then, Samuel's voice dropped low and dangerous. But you best understand this, Davidson. This little investigation of yours is over. It ends right now. Any other moves you make against Prescott Enterprises, and you will have to deal with the full weight of our political connections and our financial power. Is that what justice is to you? Works in your world? Prescott Davidson shot back. Around here, money decides what is true. Injustice? Well, that is for folks strong enough to write the rules. Samuel's heavy footsteps echoed as he headed for the door. You tell my daughter when you see her that she is needed back at the house. And I mean right now. The heavy outer door slammed shut, shaking the walls. Elizabeth sagged against Matthew for support. The weight of that confrontation they had just avoided pressed down hard on her. He knows, she whispered, her voice trembling. He knows I am helping you. Now hold on, we do not know that for sure, Matthew tried to reassure her. Could be he is just suspicious, that is all. Just then, Davidson cracked open his office door. They are gone, he said quietly, but you can bet they will be watching this whole building now. Elizabeth, you cannot just leave without being spotted. I have to go home, she insisted. I need to face my father head on. Hiding out like this just makes me look guilty. Not just yet, Davidson advised. Let us give them some time to let their tempers cool. Sarah, I need you to take Elizabeth over to your place through the back alley. She can lay low there until we figure out our next move. Sarah nodded, already grabbing her coat. Daddy is right. We need a minute to think. We cannot rush this. Elizabeth looked over at Matthew, and he could see she was torn right down the middle. This is all happening so fast, she said. Well, the truth has a funny way of picking up speed once it gets rolling, Davidson observed. The real question is, what happens next? Now is whether we were going to steer this thing or just get swept along by the current. As Sarah led Elizabeth toward the back door, Matthew felt the very ground shaking beneath all of them. A line had been drawn in the sand, and sides were chosen. A showdown that had been brewing for years was now headed for the only place it could go. Off in the distance, dark storm clouds were gathering over the mountains, black against the morning sky. Another big Montana blizzard was coming in, looking just like the human storm building up in Timberline. Matthew watched Elizabeth disappear down the alley with Sarah. Two small figures against that great, big, threatening sky. Some storms you just ride out. Others you have to face head on. This one, Matthew figured, was going to take a heap of both courage and faith before it blew over. The blizzard hit Timberline right after midnight, roaring down from them mountains like the day of Reckonin. Snow piled high in drifts against the buildings. The wind howled through the empty streets. And by dawn, the town was buried under 2 feet of fresh powder, with a whole lot more still fallen. Nature, paying no mind to the plans of men, had called a temporary ceasefire on the whole mess. Over at the Davison home, a humble 2-story clapboard house about 3 blocks from the courthouse, Elizabeth Prescott was inside. She stood by the window, just watching that storm roll in. Sleep had not come for her, not a wink, with the weight of her choice pressing down on her something fierce, just like that heavy snow blanketing everything outside. Sarah Davidson stepped quietly into the small guest bedroom, carrying a tray with some hot coffee and fresh biscuits. At 25 years old, Sarah had spent her whole life right there in her daddy's shadow, learning all about the law and doing right by people from a man who believed in both with his whole heart. She set the tray down and came to stand next to Elizabeth at the window. Daddy says this storm might just stick around for 2 whole days. The roads are already blocked up, something terrible. Elizabeth just nodded, taking the warm cup of coffee Sarah held out. My father, she said softly, he is going to be worried sick. And likely madder than a wet hen. You could have gone on home last night. And faced what? Him laying down the law, maybe locked doors? Elizabeth took a slow sip of the coffee. It was strong and honest, nothing like the fancy, imported stuff her own father always insisted on. No, she said, I just need some time to think. Sarah watched her closely. This woman seemed like she was from another world entirely. Elizabeth's simple blue dress, the one she had borrowed after her own fancy engagement gown, turned out to be less than practical, still could not hide her fine breeding. You could see it in the way she carried herself, that straight back and lifted chin that came with privilege. What are you going to do when this storm breaks? Sarah asked, her voice gentle. Elizabeth kept her eyes on the snowflakes as they danced and swirled against the window pane. I am going to do the right thing. I just have to figure out what that is. Is it the right thing to do, protecting a father who has taken so much from other folks? Is it right to bring him down? Elizabeth asked right back. He was not always like this. After my mama passed on, something inside him changed. He got harder, like he thought piling up money could somehow fill the big empty hole she left behind. Sarah went over to poke at the fire. My own mama died when I was just 12 years old. My daddy lost his arm at Shiloh that very same year. But losing people did not make him a cruel man. Some fellas bend under the weight of it all, and others just shatter. Elizabeth turned away from the window. I need to see every bit of your proof, everything you and your father have managed to dig up on Prescott Enterprises. If I am going to make this kind of choice, I have to understand exactly what my own father has really done. Sarah paused for a moment. My daddy keeps all those papers locked up tight in his office safe. Well then, we need to have a talk with him. Elizabeth stood up a little straighter. My mind is made up. I am not hiding in this room while other people decide what happens to me. I have done that for far too long. Downstairs, Judge Davidson was sitting at his desk in the little study he kept there at the house, reading over some court papers by the light of a lamp. At 65 years old, his face looked like a map of the hard country his life had been. Deep lines were carved there by the sun, the wind, and the war that cost him his arm. He looked on up as the ladies came in, and he set aside his papers. "Miss Prescott, I do hope you rested easy." "Can't say that I did, Judge." Elizabeth sat herself down in the chair across from his desk. "I need to know every single thing you have dug up about my father's business dealings. Every last bit of it." Judge Davison studied her for a moment, weighing his words. "And why is that?" "Because I need to be absolutely sure before I make a move." "Sure about what?" "That you are truly seeking justice and not just simple revenge." Elizabeth met his gaze head on. "That the proof is strong enough to justify the heartache this whole thing is bound to cause." The judge's time-worn face did not give a thing away. "And if you say no, then I will head back home as soon as this storm lets up, and I will marry James Sullivan just as it was planned. Because without being sure, my loyalty to my father has to come first." That challenge just hung there in the air right between the two of them. Judge Davidson glanced over at his daughter, who gave a small nod. Then he got to his feet and walked over to a portrait of Abraham Lincoln that was hanging on the wall, and he swung it to the side, revealing a small safe set in the wall. He turned the dial to the combination, pulled out a thick leather portfolio, and set it right on the desk. "This is everything we have put together over the last year." He then pushed it across the desk to Elizabeth. Court records, bank statements, it was all there. Documents, sworn statements from witnesses, and the whole crooked pattern of their swindling and strong-arming. Elizabeth opened that big leather folder. Her hands were steady as a rock, and inside she saw the whole ugly story of how they took apart her own father's legacy, one damning page after another. For the next 3 solid hours, she sat and read. She went through every single sheet, asking a question here and there, making a few quiet notes. The judge and Sarah stayed right there with her, answering when she asked, but staying silent otherwise. All the while, outside, that winter storm was still raging, showing no signs of letting up. The snow was piling up higher, and the wind rattled the window panes. But inside that room, a completely different kind of storm was brewing as Elizabeth finally understood the true extent of all the crimes her father had committed. At long last, she closed the folder. The color had drained from her face, but her eyes were still sharp and clear as a bell. 23 families, she said, her voice low. 23 farms and ranches, all of them taken with doctored papers, records that were pure fiction, and debts they just made up out of thin air. "Yes," the judge's voice was gentle. "It all looked legal on the surface, but it was all a lie, in fact. And my future husband, he orchestrated most of it." Elizabeth's voice wasn't asking a question. It was filled with a cold, hard certainty. "Sullivan was the one who drew up the plans. Your father provided the means to do it." Elizabeth stood up then, moving to the window. Through the breaks in the blowing snow, she could just about make out the land, distant shape of the Prescott mansion up on the hill, its lights glowing against the blinding white snow. "So what happens now?" she finally asked. "If these papers ever see the light of day, there will be criminal charges against Sullivan. Now, your daddy would probably sidestep a jail cell, given his connections, but the civil lawsuits would claim a huge chunk of his fortune," Davidson said, laying it out plain and simple. "Prescott Enterprises would come crashing down." Elizabeth let that sink in. "And Matthew Hayes, what does he get out of all this? A measure of justice, maybe some money for his stolen property, but nothing can bring back the years that were taken from him, or the parents he had to bury after they lost every last thing." Elizabeth turned to face him. "I'll help you, but I need one thing from you in return." "Name it." "I want a chance to talk to my father, in private, before any of this becomes public knowledge. Just one single opportunity to make him understand the real damage he's caused, and offer him one path to try and make things right." Davidson thought on that for a moment. That could be mighty dangerous. Sullivan wouldn't hesitate to destroy every bit of evidence if he's tipped off. "I'm not going to tip them off. I am simply going to speak with my father, all by myself." Elizabeth's voice turned to steel. "I owe him that much, not for his sake, but for the good man he was, before all this greed just ate him alive." "Very well," Davidson said, nodded his head. "When this storm finally breaks, you will have your moment. But we are going to need a safety net, some protection in place." "What kind of protection are we talking about?" Matthew Hayes will ride along with you over to the Prescott estate. He will wait outside. But if you do not come back out within an hour, or if you give some kind of signal for help, he is coming in." Elizabeth raised an eyebrow. "You put that much faith in him?" "I surely do." Davidson's voice was firm, leaving no room for argument. "Hayes is a man who stands on his principles, a rare thing any time and a treasure in times like these." A sudden knock at the front door interrupted their talk. Sarah went over to answer it and returned just a moment later with Matthew Hayes. Snow was dusting his hat and his coat, and he was dragging his right leg just a little as he stamped the snow from his boots on the entryway rug. The bitter cold was clearly bothering his old war wound. "Judge," Matthew said with a respectful nod. "Miss Prescott." "Hayes, come on in." Davidson gestured for him to come closer. "I did not expect to see anyone out and about in this storm. I was just coming from the courthouse, had some papers I needed to finish up." Then Matthew's gaze settled on Elizabeth. You could see the concern in his eyes. "The whole town is buzzing. Prescott's men are going around asking questions about where Miss Prescott might be." "Let them ask all they want," Davidson said calmly. "This storm will keep them busy. Busy for the time being." Elizabeth took a long look at Matthew. The snow was melting right off his coat, making a little puddle there at his feet. His face looked plain worn out, but you could still see the fight in his eyes. She wondered just how far he'd trudged through that blizzard, and what for. What was the real reason he was here? "Mr. Hayes," she said, "would you mind walking with me to the kitchen? I reckon we could all use a fresh pot of coffee right now." Once in the kitchen, Elizabeth got busy with the stove and the coffee pot, feeling Matthew just standing there, a little out of place by the door. When the water started to get hot, she finally turned around to face him. "You did not come all this way for some unfinished papers." Matthew took off his hat and started turning it over in his hands. "No, ma'am. You came to make sure I was all right. It just seemed like the right thing to do. Sullivan is not the kind of man who takes kindly to being told no." Elizabeth let a small smile show. "I do not need any protecting, Mr. Hayes. I have been handling difficult men my whole entire life." "I never said you could not." He looked her straight in the eye. "But having friends in a fight always makes it easier." That simple truth just hung there in the air between them. Elizabeth felt something change in that moment, like some line between them had just blurred. In another life or another time, this man could have been someone very different to her. "I have made up my mind to help Judge Davidson," she said. "To provide evidence against my father and James Sullivan." Matthew nodded as if he was not surprised. That could not have been an easy choice. It was not, and it still is not. She turned back to the stove right as the water started to boil. "But some debts just have to be paid, even by the ones who did not make them in the first place. Your father's debts are not yours to carry, are they?" Elizabeth measured coffee grounds into the pot. "I have lived a comfortable life while families like your own were made to suffer. I enjoyed privileges bought and paid for with the misfortune of other people. But you did not know. Perhaps I chose not to know." She poured the boiling water over the grounds, the rich aroma filling the small kitchen. "Looking the other way is not innocence, Mr. Hayes." They stood in a quiet moment as the coffee brewed. Outside, the storm was howling, making the windows rattle. But inside, in that warm kitchen, a different kind of understanding grew between them, as fragile as a new spring grass. After all this is said and done, Matthew finally asked, "What will you do?" Elizabeth had never once considered the question. Her entire future had always been planned for her, a path laid out by her father's wishes and by what society expected. The very freedom to choose was a foreign idea to her. "I honestly do not know," she admitted. "Everything I have ever known will soon be gone. My father brought shame on us, on our whole family name. He dragged it through the mud, and our place in this town along with it. Everything we had is gone. Not everything that matters comes from a fancy background." Matthew's voice was soft. He kept his tone kind. "Some of the best things grow in the humblest dirt." Elizabeth raised her eyes and saw him looking at her, his own eyes filled with a kindness that only comes from a man who'd seen his own share of hardship. He wasn't one to judge, and she knew then he was not just talking about her troubles. He was offering something so much more. He was offering understanding. maybe even forgiveness and a hint of a future, though neither one of them could put a name to it just then. Not yet. The coffee is ready, she said, breaking the spell. We ought to get back to the others. So they walked back into the study together. Davidson was there, pointing out something to his daughter on another one of those papers from his case. The judge looked up when they came in and took the cup of coffee Elizabeth handed him. All right, Hayes, we have come to a decision. When this storm finally breaks, Miss Prescott will go back home to have a word with her father. In private. She will do her best to convince him to make things right before we have to bring the law into it. Matthew's brow furrowed. By herself, that does not sound safe at all. Well, not completely by herself. You will go with her out to the estate. You will stay out of sight, but you step in if things go south. Matthew's eyes shifted over to Elizabeth. Elizabeth, are you absolutely certain about this? I am. My father deserves one last chance to make this right. And if he refuses, well then justice will have to run its course. Her voice didn't have a single tremble in it now. But first I need to look him square in the eye and ask him why. Why he turned his back on everything my mother held dear. Why he became the very kind of man he once swore he hated. Matthew nodded his head slowly. I'll be right there with you, for whatever you need. The day dragged on ever so slowly, with that storm showing no signs of letting up. Elizabeth helped Sarah get a simple supper on the table, and the two women found some surprising common ground, despite coming from such different worlds. Judge Davidson, he pored over all the court papers, preparing the legal fight that was about to shake the Montana territory right down to its boots. As for Matthew, he fixed a loose shutter that had been rattling and banging in the wind. It was just his practical nature, always finding a problem to solve. By the time evening rolled around, the house had become a safe harbor, a place of shared purpose. Those four unlikely friends were bound together by a deep commitment to justice and to the plain truth. After supper, as Davidson and Sarah were talking over their legal plans, Elizabeth found Matthew over in the small back parlor, just staring into the fireplace. She sat down right beside him, watching the flames dance. Judge Davidson thinks, reckon this storm will break by morning, she said. Matthew just nodded. This weather sure shifts fast, up in these mountains. Clear blue skies can show up just hours after the meanest blizzard. Are you scared? She asked him, out of the blue, of what is coming for us. He thought on that for a moment. Not scared, no, but I am concerned. Your daddy and Sullivan, they have a lot of power and connections. They are not going to surrender easily. They have never gone up against someone with nothing left to lose. There was a new kind of steel in Elizabeth's voice. That is their biggest weakness, you see. They believe every single person has a price, some kind of weak spot they can use against them. And well, everyone does. Matthew looked right at her. Even me. Even you. So what is yours? Mr. Hayes? His eyes drifted back to the crackling fire. I already lost it. You cannot lose the same thing twice. Your family's land, she asked. No. Though that sure did cut deep enough. He went quiet then, and Elizabeth knew right away that he was not going to say another word on the matter. Some hurts are just too personal to put into words, even in a quiet moment like this one. I ought to get some rest, she finally said. Tomorrow is going to take all the strength that we have. Matthew simply nodded. Good night, Miss Prescott. It is Elizabeth, she corrected him gently. After everything we have been through, I reckon we have earned the right to use our first names. A small smile touched his lips, spread across his face. Good night now, Elizabeth. Good night, Matthew. And with that, she headed up the stairs to the little guest room, knowing deep down that the next day was going to close a big chapter of her life and start a brand new one, with pages yet to be written. Clear his throat. Well, that storm finally broke long before the sun came up, and the clouds just parted ways, showing off stars as bright as scattered diamonds on the dark Montana sky. Then by sunrise, the whole world was sparkling under a blanket of fresh snow, looking all clean and brand new. The town of Timberline looked just like something out of a storybook, with all its buildings wearing little white caps and smoke curling straight up from the chimneys into that still, cold morning air. Inside, Elizabeth got dressed in the clothes she had borrowed, which were simple and sturdy, a far cry from the fancy things she was used to. Sarah had given her a heavy wool coat, and it was a blessing for keeping out that biting cold. And as she buttoned it up, Elizabeth happened to catch a glimpse of herself in the little mirror. She hardly recognized herself. She looked stronger. The woman looking back at her was not just Samuel Prescott's daughter anymore. She was becoming her own person, all because of the hard choices she had to make. Down in the kitchen, Judge Davidson, Sarah, and Matthew were all waiting. They had been huddled up talking about their next move, but they went quiet the moment Elizabeth walked in. The judge gave her a nod, a look of approval. Her appearance was practical, and her eyes were full of resolve. "The roads are finally being cleared now," he said. "By noon, folks will be able to travel freely again." "I reckon I should leave sooner," Elizabeth replied. "I will go on horseback before my father sends his men out to search for me." "I have already saddled 2 horses," Matthew confirmed. "They can handle the snow just fine if we are careful." Judge Davison then handed Elizabeth a small Derringer pistol. "Take this with you, just in case." She paused for a second, then accepted the small weapon, tucking it deep into her coat pocket. "I will not need this. My father would never do me any harm, whatever his other faults may be." Sullivan might not share those same feelings, the judge warned. "You be vigilant." Their final preparations were made in a hurry. Matthew would go with Elizabeth all the way to the Prescott estate, staying hidden but always nearby. If she did not come out within 1 hour, or if she signaled there was trouble by drawing the curtains closed in her father's study, Matthew was to go in. In the meantime, Judge Davidson would get the legal papers all in order to make a move against Prescott Enterprises, filing them only after Elizabeth had her confrontation. They slipped out through the back door, with Matthew leading 2 horses through the snow-filled streets. Not many people were out and about yet. The whole town was still trying to dig its way out from that big storm. They finally made it to the edge of town without any trouble. Then they climbed on their horses and started the ride toward the Prescott estate, that big house up on the hill that looked down on all of Timberline. The journey was slow going. It took a lot longer than usual, with the horses struggling through snow that was clear up to their knees. Elizabeth rode just a little ways ahead, practicing in her mind exactly what she was going to say to her father. She wasn't planning on throwing accusations, just asking questions. She wasn't there to pass judgment, but to appeal to the good man she knew he used to be. They finally stopped at the line of trees that marked the edge of the Prescott property. The mansion stood about 200 yards away, its windows already glowing warm in the early morning light. Matthew swung down from his horse and reached up to help Elizabeth. 1 hour, he reminded her, his voice low and steady. "If you are not back out here by then," he said, "I am coming in to get you." Elizabeth nodded, suddenly realizing this might be the very last time she would ever look at her childhood home and see it the same way. After today, everything was going to change. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Not just for this, but for showing me what true character looks like when things get hard." Matthew looked a little uneasy with her kind words. "I am just doing what needs to be done," he mumbled. Well, not many men can truly say as much. Without thinking, Elizabeth reached out and touched his arm. "Whatever happens in there, I will not regret coming here today." She turned and walked right through the snow, heading for the mansion with her back straight and her head held high. Matthew watched her all the way until she reached the front door. Then he guided the horses deeper into the trees to wait and keep watch. Elizabeth used her own key to let herself into the house and was mighty surprised to find no servants anywhere in the main hall. Usually by this time of day, the house would be humming with activity. She took off the coat she had borrowed, hung it in the entryway, and then made her way straight to her father's study. The door was closed, but a line of light showed from underneath it. She knocked, good and firm. "Enter." It was Samuel Prescott's voice, sounding worn out but still full of command. Elizabeth opened the door to find her father sitting at his desk, still wearing the clothes from the day before. He had clearly been up working straight through the night. Papers were spread all over the normally perfect surface. He looked up, his surprise quickly turning to relief, which then hardened into pure anger. "Elizabeth," he said as he stood, "2 whole days, not one word. Do you have any idea the worry you have caused around here?" "I needed time to think," she replied, her voice calm. "The storm gave me that." "Think about what? About running away from your duties and embarrassing this entire family in front of the whole territory?" His voice began to rise. "Where on earth have you been?" "That does not matter now." Elizabeth firmly closed the door behind her. "We need to have a talk, Father. It is about the Montana Territorial Bank and about the foreclosures." And about James Sullivan. Samuel went completely still. What kind of foolishness has Davidson been whispering in your ear? It is not foolishness. It is evidence. Elizabeth walked to the chair right across from his desk, but she stayed on her feet. 23 properties, all taken through dishonest dealings, altered loan papers, and falsified payment records. And your signature is on every single one, authorizing it all. These are business dealings you could not possibly understand. Samuel's face flushed a deep red. The bank was simply looking out for its own interests against borrowers who could not be counted on. Borrowers? You mean people like the Hayes family, who made every single payment on time, only to have their records changed after the fact? Samuel's eyes narrowed. So that is what this is? You have gone and gotten some starry-eyed notion about that ranch hand. And now you are about to throw away your own future because of his sad little story. This is not about Matthew Hayes. This is about you. Elizabeth's voice was as steady as a rock. The man who raised me to believe in honesty and doing the right thing. The man who once told me that a person's character is worth more than any amount of profit. What in the world happened to him, Father? He woke up. He realized how the world really works. This world rewards strength, not soft hearts. Samuel walked over to the big window, looking out at his land, all covered in a fresh blanket of snow. Everything I have built, I did it for you. A legacy that was supposed to secure your future. And this is how you decide to thank me, by teaming up with my enemies. They are only your enemies, Father, because you are the one who made them that way. Elizabeth came and stood right there beside him. Judge Davidson has plenty of evidence for filing criminal charges against Sullivan and for filing civil suits against you. But I talked him into giving me this one last chance to talk with you about it first. Samuel turned to face her with real surprise in his eyes. Why would you do a thing like that? Because I still remember the kind of father you were before Mama passed on. The man who taught me to ride a horse, who read me stories every single night, and who believed in something more important than just numbers in a book or profit margins. Elizabeth's voice got quiet and soft. That man deserves one chance to make all of this right. Make what right? Business is just business. And stealing is stealing, whether you do it with a gun or with a fancy pen. Elizabeth met his gaze without flinching. You have a choice, Daddy. You can make things right with all the families that you have hurt so badly. Or you can face public shame and complete financial ruin when Judge Davidson files his case. Samuel just stared at his daughter, seeing for the first time he saw not his obedient little girl, but a woman with a backbone and real conviction. For just a second, something that looked an awful lot like recognition flickered in his eyes, as if he caught a glimpse of his late wife in Elizabeth's steady resolve. You would tear down your own family name, everything I have built up? Samuel's gaze drifted over to Sarah's portrait hanging on the wall. For a moment, he seemed to see her not as just oil and canvas, but just as she had been, so full of life, so principled, and never backing down on her belief that having wealth meant nothing without your honor. Your mother once told me something I have spent 20 long years trying to forget, he said softly. She said a man who gives up his integrity just to feel secure ends up having neither. He touched the frame ever so gently. I thought I was building a legacy for you. Instead, it seems I have been dismantling everything she ever valued. To save what is left of our honor, yes. Elizabeth reached for his hand. It is not too late, Daddy. Return the properties. Make things right financially. You will still be a wealthy man, just not ridiculously so. Samuel pulled his hand away, moving back toward his desk. And Sullivan, what becomes of your engagement? There is no engagement. Not anymore. But Elizabeth touched the place where that fancy diamond ring used to be, just the night before. I will not marry a man who builds his fortune on other people's misery. Samuel just sank down into his chair, heavy-like, the full weight of his actions finally breaking through all his tough defenses. For a good long while he did not say a word, just stared at the papers spread out in front of him. When he finally looked up, his face looked like it had aged 10 long years. Sarah would be so ashamed of the man I have become, he said, his voice quiet, talking about his wife who had passed on. She always saw the good in everybody. All I see is what I can get out of them. It is not too late to change that, Elizabeth pressed on. Make things right. Start all over. But the door swung open before Samuel could even answer. James Sullivan barged right in without so much as a knock, his expensive suit looking perfect. His face was a mask of calm, but his eyes were burning with a rage he could hardly keep bottled up. Elizabeth, well now, how convenient to find you right here. His voice was slick with a sweetness that was not real. Your father and I have been mighty worried about you. Elizabeth turned to face him square on, keeping that big desk right between the two of them. Mr. Sullivan, I was just explaining to my father that our engagement is over and done with. Sullivan's smile never faltered for a second, though his eyes got hard as stone. A decision made in a hurry and out of confusion, I am sure. We will see after we have a little talk. Privately, I am certain you will see things differently. There is nothing to talk about, Elizabeth replied. I have made my choice. Sullivan turned his gaze to Samuel. Perhaps you should remind your daughter of her duties, Samuel. To her family, to what is proper, and to a contract that was signed. Samuel Prescott stood up slowly, and something about him seemed to change. For 20 years, he had let his sadness make him a hard man and let his ambition make him blind. But now, seeing his daughter's bravery, something that had been sleeping inside him for a long time woke up. My daughter makes her own choices, James. His voice was firm now. And so do I. That confident look on Sullivan's face began to fade. What are you trying to say? I am saying our business partnership needs a second look. Right now. Samuel stood up even straight. Darn. Elizabeth has shown me some things that just do not add up. Banking business that I apparently approved, but never took a close look at myself. Sullivan's face grew dark. The banking is my territory. You have always trusted my decisions on these matters. A trust that I now believe was a mistake. Samuel's voice became like steel. Were loan papers changed on your orders, James? Were honest payments deliberately ignored to helping folks lose their homes? That is just plain crazy talk. Sullivan looked back and forth between the father and his daughter. She has been listening to Davidson and that cowboy filling her head plumb full of nonsense. Court records do not lie, now do they? Elizabeth shot back. And neither do the 23 families who lost every last thing they owned while Prescott Enterprises was getting rich off their bad luck. That was it. Sullivan's cool finally cracked. He slammed his fist right down on the desk. Those people were weak. They did not deserve it anyway. We built something that will last from land they would have just wasted. The pure, raw greed in his voice just hung there in the air, convicting him with its honesty. Samuel took a step back as if he had been slapped right across the face, seeing his partner for who he truly was. Good Lord, he whispered, what in the world have we done? But Sullivan got himself back together in a real hurry, straightening his jacket. We did what successful men have always done. We seized an opportunity where other folks stumbled. He turned to Elizabeth. This little fairy tale idea of justice you have is charming, but it is not practical. The papers are already drawn up for our wedding. The governor himself saw us get engaged. You will honor that commitment. Or what? Elizabeth challenged him. Or your daddy faces ruin. Sullivan's voice dropped down real low, dangerously. I have got documents with his own signature authorizing every single transaction. If I go down, he is going down right with me. Samuel moved to stand by his daughter's side. Then I will go down, but not before I make things right. Sullivan just stared at the two of them, then he laughed, a cold sound that had no humor in it. How touching. A father and daughter united in their righteous poverty. He moved toward the door. You have until high noon to think it over, Elizabeth. After that, I am filing papers to dissolve Prescott Enterprises, and I will be naming your father as the main person responsible for all the questionable dealings. He left, with the door closing softly behind him. That was more threatening than if he had slammed it shut. Elizabeth turned to her father. He will destroy the evidence and try to pin all the blame on you. Let him try that. Samuel walked over to a safe, dialing the combination. I have been keeping my own records. I call it my insurance policy. a little protection against any unforeseen problems. He took out a thick folder and handed it to Elizabeth. Every last transaction, every single property, Sullivan's own instructions in his own handwriting, and my authorizations, the dates, amounts, changes, everything that Davidson would ever need to build a solid case. Elizabeth stared at the folder, completely speechless. Folder? And then looked straight at her father. You knew this whole time. I had a feeling, but I chose not to look any deeper. You could see the real regret on Samuel's face. He looked truly sorry. After your mother passed on, well, nothing seemed to matter much, except for building something that would last, something that nobody could just take away from me like they took her. Sullivan, he came along and offered a way to get that kind of security, and I grabbed it without even thinking about the price. And now, well, now we gotta face that price together. He squared his shoulders. You take this right to Davidson. Tell him I'm ready to stand up and testify against Sullivan, and that I'll make things right with every single family that got hurt. Hold on, there's more, Samuel said, as he opened a drawer and pulled out a small journal. For this past year, I've been writing down all of Sullivan's wrongdoings, things that just didn't sit right with me, but I told myself it was just part of doing business. He handed the little book to Elizabeth. Maybe I was just waiting for somebody to make me face the man I had turned into. Elizabeth felt her eyes start to well up, a wave of emotion catching her by surprise. It was not exactly joy, but it was a feeling of justice. The father she always remembered was still in there, underneath that tough shell he had built up. This is not going to be easy, Dad, she told him gently. Your good name, your place in this town, it will all be gone. Ain't worth a thing next to your good name. Samuel gently took her hand. Your mama would be mighty proud of you today. I know I am, even though I don't have any right to be. Just then a flicker of movement outside the window caught Elizabeth's eye. Matthew Hayes was standing right there at the edge of the trees, keeping a close watch on the house. His hour was about up, and he was ready to step in if he had to. She walked over to the window and gave him a little wave, just to let him know she was all right. He nodded back one time, and you could see the relief on his face even from that far off. Is that your cowboy? Samuel asked, following her gaze. He's not mine, Elizabeth answered, but he's a good man, and he deserves to see justice done. Samuel nodded his head real slow. Well then, let's make darn sure he gets it, him and all the other folks too. They walked out of the study together. Samuel Prescott was carrying the proof of his own wrongdoing, finally ready to face whatever was coming to him. Outside, the winter sun was just sparkling on the fresh snow, looking all bright and clean. It felt like a new day in more ways than just one. Later that evening, after he'd had his meeting with Judge Davidson, Samuel went back to his study all by himself. The same room that had seen so many of his business deals now just felt hollow. He started taking off his gold cufflinks one by one, and then his expensive watch, laying them on the desk. They were symbols of a success that had turned shackles. He poured himself a splash of brandy into a glass, but then he paused, setting it aside without even a sip. For the first time in decades, he needed a clear mind, not the comfort of the liquor. Through the window pane, he could see the lamps lit in town, in the homes of people he had treated so poorly. Tomorrow was going to bring shame, losing all his money, and the complete collapse of everything he had built. And yet, as he just stood there, Samuel felt something mighty unexpected. It was not exactly peace, mind you, but it was the absence of a great weight. Like a man who had been carrying a burden for so many years, he had forgotten how to stand up straight without it. Well, Sarah, he whispered into the quiet room, it appears our daughter has more of you in her than me after all, and thank God for that. Spring was late coming to the Montana territory that year. Even in April, you could find patches of snow still holding on in the shady spots. But little green shoots were pushing their way up through the thawed earth, just as stubborn and determined as could be. And in Timberline, change had arrived just as powerfully as the seasons. James Sullivan was finally facing a trial on several counts of fraud and for tampering with evidence. His plan to hightail it out of the territory had been stopped cold by Judge Davidson's quick thinking, freezing all his money and putting out the warrants before Sullivan could even get close to the border. Railroad. Now he was just waiting on his sentence. His whole empire had crumbled, and his name was nothing but mud. Meanwhile, Samuel Prescott had managed to stay out of jail in exchange for cooperating fully and paying folks back. The big old Prescott mansion was sold off to cover the payments to all the families hurt by the bank's crooked ways. Samuel himself had moved into a humble little house in town and was working to rebuild not his wealth, but his own good name. About a week after Sullivan's trial, Samuel happened to run into Matthew right there outside the courthouse. The two of them just kind of looked at each other a bit awkwardly, with all the history hanging heavy between them. "Mr. Hayes," Samuel said with a nod, his whole demeanor so different from that high and mighty banker from months before. "I hear you got your family's property back." "Yes, sir," Matthew answered, plain and simple. Samuel paused for a moment, then stuck out his hand. "No amount of saying sorry can bring back the years taken from you. But I need you to know that of all the wrong I have done, what happened to your family is what weighs on me the most." Matthew looked down at that outstretched hand, and then he took it, just for a moment. Maybe it was not forgiveness, but it was an understanding. "A man is not just judged by the mistakes he makes," he said softly, "but by how he goes about setting them right." Samuel just nodded, understanding the kindness he was being shown. "Elizabeth sure does speak highly of your plans for the farm. Just simple plans and honest work." "That's the best kind," Samuel replied, and he meant every word of it. Judge Wilson had weathered his own kind of storm, too. You see, Sullivan's dirty scheme to get a hold of his ranch had been brought into the light before any papers could ever be signed. With Davidson's legal smarts, Wilson had locked down an agreement that protected his water rights and his property lines. He had decided to stay right here in Timberline, after all, finding a new purpose in guiding the younger ranchers. He had even offered Matthew some work now and then, though he knew that Hayes was focused on rebuilding his own family's legacy. Now the old judge had become a regular sight over at Davidson's chess games. The two old soldiers were finding some common ground, beyond which side of the war they had fought on. On a bright and clear April morning, Matthew Hayes stood on a familiar piece of dirt. His dirt, given back to him as was only right. 20 acres his own grandfather had cleared by hand. The little farmhouse his father had built with his own two hands, now his again, by right and by law. The buildings needed a good bit of work after 5 long years of neglect. But the soil was still rich, the water ran clear, and the promise of it all felt real as daylight. He knelt down, taking a handful of that earth, letting it run right through his fingers. This was the land that had known his family's sweat and blood, the very land that held his own parents' graves on the small hill behind the farmhouse. Land he figured he had lost for good. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made him get to his feet, brushing the dirt from his hands. Elizabeth Prescott was riding toward him, dressed for the country in a simple riding skirt and jacket. She had surely changed in the last few months, letting go of all the fancy things for a much simpler way of life. But that natural grace she had was still there, plain as day. She swung down from her horse, tying the reins to the old broken fence that marked the edge of the property. "It sure looks different in the spring," she said, looking around. "It looks hopeful," Matthew nodded. "It is good soil. With some hard work, it will be producing again by fall." "Well, Judge Davidson approved the very last restitution payment yesterday," Elizabeth told him. "All 23 families have now received what was owed to them, plus interest. My father kept his word. He truly did." You could hear the pride in her voice. "I will tell you, it has not been easy for him. Starting over at 60 years old, facing his old friends who now just turn their backs. But I have seen glimpses of the good man he used to be. The father I remembered." They walked on together toward that old farmhouse, its weathered boards still standing strong, despite years of emptiness. Matthew was already making repairs, you see, putting in new window panes and fixing that busted porch step. "Are you going to rebuild out here?" Elizabeth asked. "Yes, ma'am. I'll start simple. Just what I need to get myself through the winter." Matthew looked out over the property, seeing not what was there, but what it could be. "Come next spring, I reckon I'll add on to it, maybe plant some apple trees down along the south field. Apple trees take a long while to bear fruit. Well, some things are worth the waiting for." He looked right at her then, straight on, with no games. "And how about you? You still working at the schoolhouse?" Elizabeth nodded. 3 days a week, teaching the little ones their reading and numbers. The rest of my time, I'm helping Sarah Davidson with her court papers. The judge says I have a real knack for keeping things organized." They had reached the porch by then. Matthew motioned to the steps, and they sat down side by side, looking out over the land that rolled out before them, all green and full of promise. "The town's still talking," he said after a quiet moment. "About you, about the choices you've made." "Well, let them talk." Elizabeth's voice didn't have a hint of regret. "I've heard enough whispers to last a lifetime." Last a lifetime, but they seemed to matter yes to each and every day. Matthew watched her, the way she held her head, the set of her chin, those clear eyes that saw the world for exactly what it was. Yet she was always working toward what it ought to be. In all the time since that whole mess with the Sullivan trial, he'd really gotten to know the real woman behind the wild circumstances of how they first met. He saw her grit, her quiet way of finding a laugh, and how she was ready to start all over again without a lick of bitterness. "I'm fixin' to head to Helena next week," he said, kinda quiet-like. "Need some supplies that old Weber just doesn't carry. Seed, some new tools, and lumber for some repairs. It's a long haul for one man. I was thinking maybe you'd want to ride along." The words came out a little rough, a bit uncertain. "That is, if you don't have other plans." Elizabeth turned to look at him, her eyes wide with surprise. "To Helena," he added. "In a town that size, folks don't know a thing about your past. They don't give a hoot about old names or money that's long gone." Matthew kept his gaze fixed on the faraway mountains. Just two folks, traveling together. Nothing more complicated to it than that. The offer just hung there in the air between them. It was not exactly a proposal, but it sure felt like a beginning. A new door had opened, and they could both choose to walk right on through it. And then Elizabeth smiled, a real true smile that reached all the way to her eyes. "I would like that very much." They sat there for a spell, quiet and comfortable in the spring air. A gentle breeze swept across the land, carrying the smell of new growth in a world of possibility. Behind them, the house stood there, just waiting to become a real home once more. Before them stretched fields all ready for planting, and right there between them, something delicate but strong was taking root, kind of like the first green shoots of wheat pushing up through that Montana soil after the long, quiet winter. Some legacies are written down in bank books and on property deeds, but others are found in the quiet choices made when a good heart meets a real opportunity. The ones that last, the ones that truly endure, they're written right on the heart, passed down from one generation to the next by the example you set, not the inheritance you leave. As that afternoon sun warmed up the old porch, Elizabeth just reached out and gently touched Matthew's hand. He turned his own palm right up, their fingers lacing together without any big show or fancy words. A simple connection, as honest as the good earth right beneath their feet. Way off in the distance, the mountains stood like silent old witnesses, not changed by any human plans or passing seasons. They had seen great empires rise up and fall, seen fortunes made and lost, and love found in the most unlikely of circumstances. They would see it all happen again, more times than you could count, over more years than you can imagine, but maybe never with quite the same quiet strength as they saw that day. A woman who had let go of her fortune for what was right, and the man who refused to give up on his principles, even when he had nothing else left. Some storms in life hit you hard and fast, changing the whole landscape in a single night. Others move real slow, wearing away at the weak spots until only the solid truth is left standing. Both kinds are needed in their own time and season. The distant church bell over in Timberline rang 4 times, marking the hour. Matthew and Elizabeth just stayed put, right there on the porch of the farmhouse that had once been lost but was now found again. 2 small figures against that big old Montana sky, not building some grand empire, but building a life. Simple and honest, and it was all theirs.